The third question is a little more difficult, and it's that are policy decisions being made implicitly in the implementation of a project, or are they explicit? I would argue that lots of times within projects, we make decisions implicitly. We decide to do something, and it actually has policy implications. Felicia will remember the time in the city when we were dealing with wet weather, we were dealing with the sewer program, and they came forward with a major sewer. And there's a design criteria in sewers called the D over D. It's the depth of flow versus the diameter. And my question to the team at that time was, okay, you're recommending this D over D. What happens if we apply that programmatically across the entire system? Well, it's $800 million. I think that was an example of a decision that was going to be made implicitly rather than explicitly. And I think a lot of the discussion we just had, when we go forward and look at projects, we are making decisions implicitly that affect policy, and we aren't forcing ourselves to be explicit. And I think that it robs us both of opportunity and it opens us to criticism. The goal is to drive an integrated, outcome-driven approach. And I think that if you ask questions like that early in projects, you get something. So this is the bottom-up view. I want to spend a moment talking about top-down. The European Union had major policy efforts top-down relative to water policy, and I want to review the scorecard. The EU is a different place than the US. The biggest difference is sustainability is in almost every citizen's vocabulary, where I would still argue it's not in the US. Events like Katrina change that here and drive us. But the EU, you go and you talk to an average citizen in the UK, they understand sustainability and they're thinking about it. But from a water policy standpoint, the EU really focused on a top-down on the Water Framework Directive, which in real shorthand was a watershed planning effort requiring broad watershed issues, mandating approaches. They also took a bottom-up or a local level at a project level on urban wastewater treatment and drinking water directives, not unlike EPA has done with both water quality and wastewater treatment standards historically. What were the results? From the bottom up, the preponderance of expenditure has been focused on those project level activities. Goals are still not quite accomplished. I think that that's common throughout the world. So that's not all that different. From top down, the directive has been integrated into national laws. However, it hasn't been implemented. And the reason is the political jealousies that exist when a top-down directive is attempted to be implemented without the political force and without really the understanding, either regionally or nationally, of the need. Conclusions, national governments, and I would argue state and regional governments, resist top-down and non-jurisdictional directives, support fractures upon pre-existing traditional political lines. While there was impact achieved at the facility level, dramatic events did not surface in the UK to make that difference. So let's look at Australia, because there were dramatic events in Australia. Australia is in one of the most severe droughts in its history, and I want to follow the phases, and I've divided into 4 phases. Pre-drought, which was business as usual, early drought, where effort was focused at the local level, midterm drought, regional and state efforts, and extended drought, which becomes a federal intervention approach. If you look at the Australian timeline, What we're going to do is work our way left to right, talk about the drought phase, what sort of change was there, how things occurred. And we start back pre-drought around 1990. And the first phase, business as usual, everything was focused on pollution control. And you saw projects dealing with reuse, and you saw disposal projects. But they were principally driven by pollution control objectives. One of the things you also saw was the implementation time frame for these projects was on the order of 15 to 20 years. There was nothing that was done quickly. The second phase is early drought. What occurred there was local response, and they did local water resource management. And what they found was they identified some local water cycle management plans that would be developed. And then there were a couple of indirect potable reuse projects that were proposed. The reason they're crossed out is they never went forward. The localities could not implement, even in the early phases of the drought. So localities, in a narrow sense, were not capable of responding. In the mid-drought, what you saw was the evolution of state governments in New South Wales, Victoria, and other places beginning to intervene. And they developed local or regional integrated water cycle management plans. And they focused on state-level recycling in Brisbane, indirect potable reuse. But you'll notice up at the top, state desalination, which is what Paul was talking about earlier. What they did, because of the urgency, was they moved to big projects. At the same time, they were consolidating and collapsing agencies. The view was there were too many agencies, decision-making was too disparate, and so they collapsed. What that tended to do, again, was drive to bigger solutions, not necessarily smarter solutions. And it's only in the extended drought that the federal intervention has occurred, where they've actually, for the first time, put forward a national water policy. Now, the problem is that when I talk to our colleagues in Australia, the sense is the drought is sort of easing and the heat's off. So I guess my counsel would be, I think climate change is a big driver, but the lesson in Australia is not to be behind the curve. I think you've got to be moving forward. You can't be a victim of time. And I think that that's what happened in Australia when you look at this overall. So what are the lessons, imperatives in summary? I still maintain that the project level opportunity must be exploited because it is the easiest to control. We still have an ability to make a difference there. Is it enough? No. I think the second is that there does need to be a national policy framework, but it needs to recognize regional differences and encourage collaboration. That's going to be a very tough thing because the federal government in the US typically likes to have an equal playing field, except when it comes to earmarks, perhaps. The third point is that major events can accelerate progress, but are not sufficient singularly or necessarily efficient. And so what I would be saying is we have to create the urgency before those events, because when the events occur, it's too late. You really, at that point, it's very difficult for people to maintain the discipline on what the right thing to do is. What they end up doing is what is the fastest thing to do. And speed overwhelms everything. I think a final or fourth point is that time horizons need to expand for vision and shrink for implementation. I do believe by the charrette processes and others that Patrick's outlined, you can actually shorten that process. And you can, by spending some time diverging at the outset, you can end up converging.